My name is Finn, and I've been a park ranger in the Redwood National Park for nearly 10 years. It's a place of humbling, ancient beauty, but also deep isolation. Most of my job involves mundane things: issuing permits, clearing fallen debris, and advising tourists. Yet, the old-timers who train us always say, "You'll see things out there the map doesn't cover." I used to think they were exaggerating. This happened during the late summer patrol season. I was driving the perimeter road, a dusty single-lane track miles from the main highway. The sun was dipping below the canopy, casting long, fractured shadows across the forest floor. Visibility was getting poor, which meant my shift was almost over. That's when I saw her. She was running, not jogging, but sprinting full out down the main fire trail that intersects the perimeter road. She wore dark, loose clothing, and her face was obscured by thick, wind-swept hair. What immediately struck me was the sheer unnatural speed she possessed. She was moving faster than any sustained human effort could allow, but she was silent. There was no audible puffing, no rhythmic pounding of feet hitting the packed dirt. I slowed the truck down, leaning out the window. It's mandatory to check on anyone in the restricted zones after dusk. "Hey, are you all right? You need a ride?" I yelled. She didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. As she closed the distance, I expected her to wave or at least slow down, but she didn't. Instead, her pace seemed to accelerate. As she passed my truck, no more than 5 feet away, I got a clear, chilling look at her movement. Her body was impossibly rigid. Her elbows were locked straight and her knees were lifting too high too fast. It was like watching a marionette being pulled by frantic, invisible strings. And her ankles? They were bent at a slight, disturbing angle that suggested her feet weren't landing naturally. I finally got a glance at her face as she shot past. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and glazed over, the eyes of someone either in deep shock or perhaps not fully conscious. But the most unsettling thing was the expression. There was no panic, no fear, just a terrible, blank exhaustion. I slammed the truck into gear and followed her for about half a minute, watching that inhuman pace continue. "Stop running," I yelled over the engine noise. "You're entering a restricted zone." She suddenly darted off the trail, plunging directly into a dense thicket of thorny bushes and undergrowth. I braked hard. No sane person would run into that. It was too dense. She'd be shredded by the thorns. I grabbed my flashlight and jogged to the spot where she disappeared. I pushed aside the bushes, expecting to find her entangled, bleeding, or perhaps unconscious. But there was nothing. No sound of thrashing, no disturbed leaves, just a tiny gap in the foliage where she had vanished. I stood there for a minute, heart hammering, trying to process the impossibility of her speed and her disappearance. Then, from the deep darkness where the figure had vanished, a sound echoed. Thwack! Something hard and heavy struck the side of my Ranger truck. I spun around. On the ground beside the truck was a large, jagged piece of granite, the size of a fist. There's no way it could have been thrown from the spot where the runner disappeared. It was too far and the throw too powerful. It was thrown from the absolute blackness of the woods, far off the trail. I didn't wait. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I didn't feel fear. I felt something colder, something primal. I dove back into the truck, locked the doors, and drove out of there as fast as the dusty road allowed. I never reported the incident. How do you explain a hyper-fast runner with broken ankles and a terrifying blank stare. I just try not to drive that perimeter road after the sun sets anymore. And I listen. I always listen for silence where there should be the sound of footsteps. My name is Sarah, and I spent a few summers working remote assignments for the Forest Service in Montana. This particular assignment tested my limits. 3 nights at an old, disused fire lookout tower on Mount Baldy. The tower was retired 30 years ago, but they needed someone up there temporarily for radio relay testing. It stood 80 feet tall, a lonely wooden skeleton poking above the tree line. The isolation was immediate and profound. As soon as the supply truck left, I was surrounded by a silence that felt less like peace and more like crushing pressure. The single cabin at the top smelled intensely of dust and stale wood smoke. I spent the first night trying to sleep, attributing the little creaks and groans to the old wood settling and the relentless wind. The second night, however, was fundamentally different. I was trying to read by the light of a small lantern when I heard it, a distinct sound from directly above me. Keep in mind, the cabin is the top of the tower. There's nothing above the ceiling but the open sky. It was a thud, heavy, dull, and distinct. It sounded exactly like a sandbag being dropped onto the wooden roof. I froze. Wasn't the wind. The rhythm was too deliberate. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. It was slow, heavy footsteps, pacing with unnatural, deliberate weight right over my head. I tried to rationalize it, thinking of a large animal, but the steps were too rhythmic, too evenly spaced, and far too heavy for any creature I knew to sustain on that height. Whatever it was pacing in a tight circle directly above my bed. I grabbed my emergency radio, hands shaking violently, but the remote location meant only harsh, unresponsive static answered my calls. I was completely and truly alone up there. I spent hours listening to the impossible heavy pacing. The sound would stop for 30 minutes, giving me a desperate hope, only to start up again, closer and heavier than before. Around 4 a.m., the pacing finally ceased. I sighed a deep breath of exhausted relief, thinking whatever it was had gone down the ladder. The only way up or down was the external metal ladder and a hatch door on the floor of the cabin, a door I had secured with a heavy steel padlock when I arrived. Then I heard a new sound coming from the floor beneath me, a distinct, loud, metallic click. My heart leaped. That was the unmistakable sound of the padlock being forcibly unlatched. I scrambled up and looked at the hatch. It was slowly rising, pushed up from below. Through the small, widening gap, I could see only dense darkness, but I could clearly hear heavy, ragged breathing coming from the void. I grabbed a heavy toolbox and threw it down onto the rising hatch, pinning it momentarily. I heard an immense, frustrated groan from below, and the hatch slammed back down, shaking the entire wooden tower structure. I didn't wait. I fled down the internal stairway to the ground floor entrance, bolted the door, and huddled against the cold concrete wall, praying for morning light. When the sun finally hit the tower, I slowly climbed back up to the cabin. The floor hatch was still closed, pinned by the toolbox. I removed the toolbox and found the padlock hanging open on the loop. The thick steel shackle clearly bent outward, as if pried by unimaginable force. But the most disturbing discovery was on the ceiling, directly above where I had been sleeping. There were 3 long, deep scratch marks gouged into the thick wooden planks. They looked like they had been made by something long, sharp, and hard. They were too high to have been made by anyone standing, and far too deep to be random damage. I didn't wait. I immediately hiked out that morning and requested an urgent transfer. I never told my superiors the exact details, only that the old tower was unfit for duty. I still don't know what was pacing on the roof, or what bent that steel lock, but I know one thing. Whatever it was, it had come to find out who was sleeping in its space.